My name is Bob Creech, Chair of the Lexington Planning Board, and I call to order this meeting of the Lexington Planning Board. Today is Monday, December 7th, 2020, and it is 7 p.m. This meeting is organized by and managed by staff from both Lexington Economic Development and the Planning Office. Since this meeting covers zoning issues that the Planning Board may consider at a later time, and since more than 2 Planning Board members have expressed interest in attending this meeting, the open meeting law requires that this meeting also be posted as an official Planning Board meeting. Planning Board members may ask questions and offer input to this meeting, but the Planning Board will not conduct any business of its own this evening. Therefore, all questions and comments should be directed to the organizers of the meeting, specifically Sandra Iyer, Amanda Loomis, and Carol Kowalski, and whoever else they might want to answer questions. This meeting is being conducted remotely per Governor Baker's Executive Order of March 12, 2020, and the meeting is being recorded. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. If we could go to the next slide, please. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight. My name is Daphne Politis. I'm principal of Community Circle. I'm a town planner, and I also happen to be a resident of Lexington, and I'll be your moderator tonight. We're going to start with a project recap and proposed zoning after a little bit of an intro by Amanda Loomis, the town's planning director. Then Stella Carr, the sustainability director for Lexington, will give an overview of sustainability in terms of the sustainability features of the Hartwell Avenue area district. And then we have guest speakers. We have a panel discussion that will be led with Elizabeth Galloway, Hannah Payne, Craig Lizotte, and Ben Myers. And that will be followed by a 1-hour feedback session. So please hang on as we present material to you and then ask for a question and answer session that will last an hour. In addition to this feedback session that will last an hour, we are scheduling an opportunity for more discussion and more question and answers on this Thursday, December 17th. It's next Thursday, 8 to 9 a.m. So before we go on, I just wanted to establish the community conversations ground rules. Please remain on mute and direct questions to the chat during the presentation. Use that raise your hand function. And if you can't find it at the bottom of your screen on the banner that's along the bottom, then raise your hand physically next to your face and someone will see you and will call on you and unmute you. If you are on the phone, then use *6. The meeting is being recorded, and the recorded meeting and all the resources will be available on the town's website, on the new website that's been created around this Hartwell Avenue district. There will also be a live transcript for all that are interested. Next slide, please. So why is the town doing it's in order to support Lexington in its efforts to compete with other towns that are vying to attract the regional demand for life science office and lab space. And there was a recent article in the Boston Globe discussing the fact that while there have been some serious and significant downturns in some sectors of the economy, life sciences continue to not only survive, but thrive. So this district treatment, the treatment of the area as a district, is to encourage state-of-the-art facilities for life science office and lab space by creating appropriate indoor spaces that support research and development, providing both indoor and outdoor amenities, and creating more of a sense of place so that the district feels more connected, more cohesive as a district. Now it feels a bit fragmented, as most of you that have been there probably know. So this will result in helping Lexington to compete for desired companies to locate here, and the potential benefits include a significant increase to the tax base that will help to pay for some of what Lexington residents would like to see, including new schools, amenities and opportunities for socializing and recreating for Lexington residents, and of course, opportunities for employment. Next slide, please. So why create a district plan with its own zoning? Many of the buildings along the Hartwell Avenue area are coming to the end of their life cycle. So if and when a property owner wishes to redevelop them, Lexington will be poised with a plan in place. That is, redevelopment will happen gradually, incrementally over time. Once a property owner decides, okay, we've come to the end here, this building needs updating, and then they will be allowed to have more space in order to create these amenities and have the lab spaces that will help them compete with surrounding towns. So some of the office space will remain in Cambridge because they would like to have a Cambridge address and move the more expensive lab space to suburban locations. And much of the additional space will be devoted to lab and amenity space. Next slide, please. So what does this do? This creates a series of opportunities for the future of Hartwell Avenue. A more contemporary work environment for employees, outdoor amenities for residents, improved pedestrian and bike infrastructure, increased taxes for the town, sustainable buildings, and improved transportation options. Next slide, please. So Amanda, would you like to start with the vision?
Yeah, totally. So what we are using to actually help guide us when we are moving forward in this next part of the zoning effort is these planning principles. We want to make sure that we capitalize on the natural environment to build a healthy, but also recreational opportunities for the employees or visitors to the Hartwell Innovation Park. We want to make sure that we have a diversity of transportation options that will allow for people to get to and from and travel within the district other than the single occupant vehicle. We also want to establish a new interface between Hartwell and the streetscape. So we want to make sure the buildings are pulled to the front, parking to the side in the rears, but also to establish a community amenity space where people that are either working on the site or maybe visiting can kind of collaborate or just walk or just use. We also want to diversify the different types of land uses to make sure that the uses meet the market demands, but also make sure that we have diversity in those uses to allow for the ever-changing market. We also want to make sure that the permitting is done efficiently to make sure we can attract those businesses. And so it allows them to get in quicker, but also to make sure that they meet the standards that Lexington has set for them. Next slide, please. So recently, Article 16 passed at the special town meeting under Article 16. So this basically allows for increase in density because the table or the dimensional table was amended. It also consolidates existing commercial districts, which is the CSX and the CRO, into the CM, which is the manufacturing district. It eliminates floor area ratio, but also does not limit the lot area. It allows buildings to be pulled to the front of the street by reducing or eliminating the front setback, but also establishes side and rear setbacks. And then the height is allowed to go to 115 feet, with the exception of Hanscom's Air Force air flyover, but also the if you are doing HVAC over 65 feet, it has to be electric. Next slide, please. So this just kind of reiterates all of those kind of uses that what we're trying to do, but it allows for flexibility in the site layout. We're trying to create a more walkable district, which is what Article 16 did as well. But again, it allows greater density to encourage better efficient uses of the land, because as previous conversations that we've had, it shows that there's a lot of constraints: wetlands, floodplain, easements, the flyover, etc. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows what was approved under Article 16. As you can see, it moved from minimum lot area from 3 acres to 20,000 square feet, but it also reduced the frontage from 200 feet to 50 feet and established a side and rear setback from 25 to 15 feet. There is no floor area ratio because 0.35 in a commercial or manufacturing district is extremely low and doesn't allow for the type of development that is envisioned for this district. Underneath this current analysis, there's about 171 acres of developable area within the district, but there could be 91.1 acres of total building footprint. And this would include the building, parking, etc. Next slide, please. So just an overview. Last week, we released the zoning bylaw. This was just a starting point to get the conversation started. As previously mentioned, we will be having a coffee hour next week to kind of hear what people are thinking, if there's any questions that you may or may not have, or just want to know more about the zoning. It's kind of an open session for people to come provide their comments that we are taking input. So what we're doing is through the collection of comments, questions, and ideas, we are revising the draft that was released. The release of the bylaw, again, was to get the conversation started so we can make sure that it reflects the Lexington community. Next slide, please. And these were the 8 standards that we were setting to make sure that the developments meet the goals and the expectations of the Lexington community. We want to make sure that there's a mixture of uses to allow for diversity, but also kind of establishing the ground rules for the site layout, making sure that they're planning for both outdoor and indoor amenities for both their users, but also the community if that's accessible. We want to make sure alternative energy and sustainability and best management practices are established throughout this, but we also want to make sure landscaping, side buffers, trees are preserved, and maintaining the natural habitat that exists around it. Next slide, please. And I think I turn it back over to Daphne.
Thanks, Amanda. Before we move on, we'd just like to do a practice poll for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to use the poll function on Zoom before, so that when we do poll you on substantive questions, you feel a level of comfort. So Casey, if you wouldn't mind launching the poll. And she's one step ahead of me. We might want to fold this into the design guidelines. I'm actually kidding, but. It looks like Blue's got it. So thank you. Let's go to the next slide, please. But please make note of the pun. It's hip to be sustainable. That's Hartwell Innovation. Next slide, please. So if you were to guess, what do you think is the breakdown of the source of emissions between buildings and transportation in Lexington? And please launch the poll. Yeah. So about 3/4 of you have participated. Give it a couple of more minutes, a couple more seconds rather. Just give it a guess if you don't know. Okay, so it looks like most people think that buildings are responsible for 56%, transportation for 44%, but next in line is 66-24. Next slide, please. And Stella, if you would like to take over.
Yes, good evening. Can everyone hear me? All right, so as you can see, in Lexington, buildings are actually responsible for 66% of emissions, and transportation is responsible for 24% of those emissions. And in this graphic, you can see a bit more of a breakdown of what those emission sectors look like within the built environment. And when it comes to using zoning and urban design guideline strategies for sustainability goals and multi-use districts, there's a lot of ways that we can get creative with this in order to achieve our desired sustainability, resilience, and zero emissions goals and standards. These goals can be achieved using a mix of renewable energy systems and strategies such as solar and geothermal and energy storage. And when it comes to Hartwell, there are unique constraints which may prevent us from achieving some of the ideal goals with sustainability and development within this region of the town. But that's not to say that as we look at the built environment throughout Lexington, that we can't achieve a higher standard within other areas, which we hope to strive for. Next slide. And as we have been listening to concerns of citizens on previous sessions regarding Hartwell, we've put together this list of what we hear are some of the goals. And as you can see, there's a target for Lexington within our Getting to Net Zero plan. One of those targets is that our buildings are powered by 100% renewable energy sources by 2035. And as we consider what the sustainability guidelines or requirements may be for Hartwell, it's important to understand that we must balance the sustainability goals, the economic goals, and what's feasible in regards to both of those, specifically for the Hartwell Innovation Park area. And as Lexington looks to the future and the chance to transform our building stock and infrastructure, there's a great opportunity to create sustainable and resilient zero emission districts. And if we're successful, this can serve as a model for other areas in town. So if you look at this list of goals, I've outlined at the end sort of what the constraint might be for that. So when it comes to eliminating fossil fuel combustion within buildings, since we're seeking to include a lot of lab space, this may be a challenge to achieve that. And when we're looking to maximize solar generation, there are some restraints with regards to the tree canopy in this area, as well as the extra step of going through Hanscom for their approval for solar projects because of the navigation easement. And when it comes to minimizing our transportation footprint, there will be a transportation session coming up, so please save concerns regarding that as it pertains to sustainability. We hope to discuss it further and in more detail then. We also had a session on conservation where we discussed some of the stormwater management and more physical environmental challenges for Hartwell. And when it comes to toxics and promoting green space, that's what we hope to achieve with some of the design standards. And lastly, promoting zero waste is something that we can still continue to talk about as we look to making plans for Hartwell. Next slide.
So do you have any other ideas about how to become more sustainable in Lexington? If you could put your thoughts in the chat, please. That would be most useful and helpful to us.
And while you're thinking about that, some more food for thought. When it comes to what's guiding sustainability in Lexington, we have the Sustainable Action Plan, and which I will mention next, the Getting to Net Zero Roadmap. So from the Sustainable Action Plan is where I retrieved this quote at the top. There are specific goals that we have related to buildings, and those include building and maintaining municipal, residential, and commercial buildings to achieve low emissions, energy efficiency, resilience to extreme weather, and healthy indoor environments, as well as emissions from commercial businesses. They're really high in Lexington due to the office and industrial districts, so being mindful that most of our emissions come from commercial sector, and buildings specifically, we're trying to create solutions to address those concerns. There's only two real ways that we can work to reduce emissions, and that's using less energy or using cleaner energy, and best to do both. When we talk about using less energy, that's going to be encouraging efforts like adoption of highly efficient buildings, building envelope design, adoption of energy recovery ventilators, and switching to high efficiency appliances. And cleaner energy, we're considering, what energy source we're using and switching from a fossil fuel powered electricity grid to renewable sources, and seeking other renewable energy to power the electric buildings that we hope to have in Lexington. And that requires producing energy and clean green energy, which there are some limitations to what can be produced specifically within Hartwell, but it's a key component of achieving net neutral buildings and zero emissions. So these images you can see are two LEED Platinum or high LEED certified or certifiable buildings that have recently been built in neighboring communities. So you can sort of get an idea of what these types of new lab and energy efficient buildings might look like. Next slide, please. And from the Getting to Net Zero Roadmap, which is our guide for our zero emissions by 2035 goal, this chart sort of outlines the different sectors of how we can reduce the emissions in different parts. So ideally, the zoning and urban design guidelines would help to define in a way that allows for innovation and design and engineering solutions to be integrated in that plan, while also allowing flexibility to a responsible degree in how we perform, how we set performance standards and how they can be met over time as technology changes, and how with design and zoning we can create flexible planning parameters. So a flexible process which would allow for changing market conditions while integrating new renewable energy solutions so that we can have innovative development over time. And one technique to help achieve this, which isn't necessarily connected to this immediate planning of the Hartwell area, but a goal for future development within Lexington, would be to create a BUDO, or a Building Energy and Emissions Use Disclosure Ordinance, where all commercial buildings would be required to report their energy use. One example of this is to be accountable, and of course some goals can be achieved through zoning, which is why we're here today. Some other communities around us already have BUDOs, or BURDOs as they might be referred to, so this is definitely a goal that Lexington has and will be an important part of us achieving more sustainable buildings throughout town as we move forward. So that concludes my presentation about what sustainability is already doing and what our goals are for Lexington. And now we're going to move into a panel discussion. I'm very excited to introduce the following speakers. So with us tonight, we have Elizabeth Galloway, who's a building scientist with Payne, a leading architectural firm specializing in the design of science and healthcare buildings. Liz has a diverse background in engineering, building performance analysis, and sustainable design consulting. She's a tireless advocate for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and she serves on the City of Somerville's Commission for Energy Use and Climate Change, and as a representative of the green building community in support of a statewide net zero code. Thank you for being here, Liz. And next we have Hannah Payne, who is the Climate Change Program Manager for the City of Somerville. And in this role, Hannah managed the development of Somerville's first comprehensive climate action plan. It is an action-oriented plan to reduce the city's contribution to climate change and to prepare for the local impacts of climate change. She works closely with the city's Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development to incorporate sustainability and climate considerations into planning and zoning. And next, I have Craig Lizette. Sorry if I pronounced your last name incorrectly. He is the real estate and facilities manager for MassWorks as their senior facilities manager for the past 4 years. He has worked to implement and maintain very sustainable buildings for the MassWorks portfolio. They own and operate their own facilities, so it's a big undertaking. And previously, he has experience with VHB as a principal and manager of land use and development projects. Next up, there's Ben Myers, who is the Vice President of Sustainability at Boston Properties. He's an engineer and non-routine project manager with a passion for environmental and sustainable goals and social good. And his primary responsibilities include enterprise and energy water management, green building initiatives, energy conservation, measurement and implementation, resilience, public reporting, as well as a lot of other things. So we have a great panelist who are very qualified to be speaking on these issues, and I appreciate their time. So now that I've briefly introduced them, I'm going to pass it over to each of them, starting with Liz, and they can just give a quick overview of why we have invited them here tonight based on what they're currently working on. And then we're going to jump into some further questions.
Thank you, Stella. So did you want me to give a little more information about my background and the work that I do?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So as Stella mentioned, Payne is an architecture firm located here in Boston, and we specialize in laboratory and healthcare buildings. And I work specifically with the building science group, and we support kind of all the project teams in the office to advance sustainability and performance. So we conduct performance analysis, looking at different building enclosure options. And then the other thing that the building science group does is conduct longer term research projects that also support our design work.
Hannah, if you would like to go next.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Payne. I'm the Climate Change Program Manager with the City of Somerville. And so the reason that I'm here to speak with you tonight is I work, as Stella mentioned, I work closely with our Office of Planning in Somerville. And so I work a lot on implementing our zoning. And Somerville passed new zoning I think almost a year ago, exactly to the day. And in that new zoning, we have a number of sustainability priorities within that. So we have performance standards, so meeting LEED requirements for buildings of certain sizes. So I help review those projects. And we do have a few things that we've put in to incentivize net zero development. So we have a density bonus. So if you're building a residential building, you can put in more units if you build an all electric building and meet passive house standards or zero carbon standards from the Living Future Building Institute. So we have a few things like that. So those items that are in our zoning came from our climate action plan, Somerville Climate Forward, which has a number of priorities that help the city move towards meeting our goal of being a net zero city by, or having net zero emissions by 2050. And so the kind of two things that stand out that I think are related to this conversation tonight are around, so we have one priority around net zero buildings. So that's kind of what we have in zoning and a few other things that we're working on. And then the second is around state advocacy around the building code. And I can talk a little bit more about that later, but that's really where we've kind of focused on how do we move our buildings that are getting built today in Somerville, so new buildings, how do we move those to be closer to net zero emissions and meet our long-term goals? So I'll leave it there, but lots more to talk about.
Thanks, Hannah. Craig, do you want to go next?
Hello, my name's Craig Lezot, and as you said, Stella, I'm a civil engineer by education. I spent about 25 years in design consulting, most recently with VHB. I did a lot of land in the Boston area. About 5 years ago, I shifted my career and went over to MathWorks, who was a former client of mine, to help them basically own, operate anything we do with we have about 1.5 million square feet of real estate in Natick. And we have 35 offices worldwide. So like in Natick, we own and operate everything. There we have 7 solar arrays, 6 roof mounted, 1 garage mounted. We have a gas turbine cogeneration system that we own and operate. And then worldwide, I help to develop and implement our carbon strategy. I'm a resident of Sudbury, so right next door, and a former planning board member and planning board chair.
Thank you. And then last but not least, Ben.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to join this panel discussion with such a qualified panel. I'm Ben Myers. I'm the Vice President of Sustainability at Boston Properties. That's my full-time job. My part-time job is probably chauffeuring my 3 girls on the bike path to Lexington, where we're often seen getting ice cream downtown. That's my true passion. Sustainability, though, is what's going to keep this planet good for them. So that is why I would do this work. I've been working on sustainable development for about 15 years, ever since my senior design project at UMass Amherst just caught the bug. And for Boston Properties, I manage our enterprise sustainability goals, alignment with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, enterprise energy, emissions, water, and waste targets, our green building strategy, and then the 3 pillars of our program, which are climate action, climate resilience, and social good. This year, my role has been heavily focused on healthy buildings for obvious reasons. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we wanted to make sure our workplaces are safe for the repopulation of office buildings. We are primarily an office owner with 50 million feet that we own and actively manage in Boston, New York, San Francisco, DC, and Los Angeles. And we are also a growing life sciences company. So interested in talking about life sciences work and what we're doing there this evening. Again, just very happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Ben, and lovely tie collection.
They're my dad's. I'm not much of a tie guy. Their artwork, good memories.
Nice. Well, now that we have a bit of more understanding of what each of you work on and have worked on in the past, I'm interested in you sharing what some of the challenges and opportunities that you and your teams have faced or are currently facing while you're pursuing sustainable development projects, and base your answers on the context of the work that you do. We can just go through the same order, or if somebody wants to jump in first, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. Do you know if the slides that I sent, if you guys received them, or? Just a couple, just for some context. So one of the things about labs is that is particularly challenging in the context of dealing with climate change is that they're very energy intensive. And so I just got a few things to show you, just to give you a little perspective. So this is a graph that's showing, this is based on a national average of existing buildings. It shows a bunch of different typologies. And you can see that laboratories are way up there along with hospitals. And then all the other kind of typical building types sort of trail off to the right there. And one of the big reasons why labs are such a challenge is because of some of the equipment that's in them, including fume hoods. If you want to go to the next slide. So a typical fume hood, can use as much energy as 3.5 residential homes. And that's just on account of the amount of air that you have to pull through them. So you're exhausting a bunch of air to the outside to keep, safe air quality in the laboratory for the people who are in there. And then you have to bring in air from outside to make up for that. And, in a New England winter, that is a lot of heating. And in the summer, it's a lot of cooling to deal with that. And then another issue related to laboratories is redundancy. So needing backup equipment to deal with anything that's out. So you can go ahead to the next slide. I just pulled together a couple of quick examples. you know, without getting into kind of all the nitty gritty, I mean, certainly you got to get into still making as much as you can of efficiency to get to very low energy use buildings, including labs. But kind of the key things that are really challenging for laboratory buildings is going to be heating and hot water. And if you think about your end uses in your building, you've got, you know, lighting, plug loads, ventilation, cooling, heating, hot water. A lot of those can already be handled with electricity. It's the heating and hot water that you really need, kind of the combustion to really get enough energy to meet those loads. And so there are a couple ways that we're starting to see our projects be able to deal with those, and we kind of push down and kind of squeeze as much out in terms of energy efficiency that enables some other end uses. So this is the Chelsea Soldiers Home, which is in construction right now. And this project was able to use ground source heat pump system. So take advantage of those kind of stable temperatures in the earth. And heat pumps are very efficient electric-based systems that allow you to move heat rather than trying to create heat like you do if you're burning natural gas. So it's a lot more efficient of a process. And then in terms of redundancy, this facility also required a backup system. In this case, they opted to have natural gas boilers just as an emergency backup because this is a long-term care facility. They can't have the systems just go down, but it's very expensive and difficult to build 2 sets of ground source heat pumps systems. So that was how, in this particular case, we were able to handle meeting those heating and cooling loads. Now, I should say this is a healthcare project, but healthcare has a lot of the same challenges in terms of higher ventilation requirements as labs do. And then if you want to just go to the next slide. So this is the Cape Cod Community College. This is a new science center that is in design. And again, this was a project, the Cape Cod Community College was actually one of the initial signatories of the president's climate commitment, University President's climate commitment. And so from the outset, we really were trying to push for getting to an all electric, very low energy building. And that kind of drove a lot of the design of the building enclosure and the thinking about the building systems. This particular case, the conditions were not ideal for doing ground source heat pumps. So we opted for air source heat pump systems, which are a little more challenged in that, you know, the air temperature outside is not as warm in the wintertime as say, you know, the ground temperatures are. So this building does have designed natural gas boilers. Now, we had looked at doing an electric emergency backup, emergency boiler for those times when it was really too cold for the heat pumps. But the challenge with that was it would have required a much larger generator. And so there was a lot of first cost associated with doing that when we were really probably only going to run those boilers like 4% of the hours during the year. So in this case, we got sort of, you know, the best bang of the buck with the air source heat pumps. We still have natural gas boilers, but it's only going to be a very small percentage of the year that's going to be used. So those are some of the challenges and opportunities that we're starting to see on our some of our recent work.
I don't know, Liz, if you wanted to comment on someone who is saying the fume hood should exhaust via air to air heat exchangers. Is that something you'd like to comment on?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of things that you can do. Certainly, glycol runaround loops to capture a lot of the energy in the exhaust stream, and then transfer that to the air that you're bringing in. And there are other measures for controlling energy use in fume hoods. It kind of depends on what's going on in the lab, what makes the most sense, but you can implement using sash auto closers. So after a period of time, if the sash on the hood is left open, it will automatically close it down, and that reduces the amount of airflow going through it. You can reduce the kind of standard amount of airflow. So it's typical to see like 100 feet per minute is kind of a typical in terms of face velocity in that open part of the fume hood. You can also, depending on the level of comfort and what you're doing, projects will reduce that to 80 or 60 feet per minute. And you can still get fume hoods that have good entrainment, the chemicals with that. And then you're really reducing that volume of air that's going through it. So there's a bunch of strategies that you can do to mitigate that. But with labs, that's one of the big challenges, is having a lot of fume hoods.
And one last question before, oh, sorry.
One other comment on that question. My first laboratory project was a Payette project, Sherman Fairchild Lab, the LEED Platinum at Harvard University on Oxford Street. And there we had dual wheel enthalpy heat recovery. I had to do the life cycle cost analysis for the Green Building Services group at Harvard. And so that was the first time I saw large heat recovery, but it was mostly serving the office spaces, because there are concerns about contamination, especially when you have air exhausted from fume hoods that contains noxious toxic chemicals. There's fear of leakage. So you have to, it's possible, but it, like Liz said, it's usually a glycol run around loop and not something as simple as typical heat exchange in an office building.
Thanks for clarifying that, Ben.
And then one last question on this before we move on is, what was the impetus for these buildings being built this way in a sustainable manner rather than using traditional construction?
Well, as I mentioned, the Cape Cod Community College, they were one of the initial signatories. And so they had a real kind of interest in, and this is a building, the first building that they've built. I mean, I don't think there's been a new building on that campus in the last like 30 years. And so and it also is kind of serving as a sort of central hub for the students, because there's not really like a good sort of gathering place where the students can get together and like collaborate. And so I think there was a real interest in kind of connecting with that kind of younger generation and kind of acting out that on that commitment to addressing climate change. And the other project is a DCAM project. So that was, I think, with the goal of looking towards the state's commitment to, meeting 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that was the real driver there.
Thanks, Liz. And since we have 3 more panelists, well, let's just try to hold the questions till the end.
Hannah, if you'd like to jump in next, let me know if you need the question repeated or not.
Sure. No, I can jump in and share the perspective from the kind of the city side. So I work for the city of Somerville, and I'll just say I am not a building engineer, architect. So all this nitty gritty that Liz just went into, I'm so glad that Liz and Ben and Craig are on this panel, because I'm much more on the policy side of things. So some of the challenges and opportunities that we have as cities and towns in Massachusetts, I think I'll start with the challenges. The first is zoning is one tool that we have. It is not the perfect tool to address all of our sustainability goals. Zoning really sets parameters for what can be built in a space, but can't dictate exactly what a design should be. And then in addition, in Massachusetts, our building code is set at the state level, and cities and towns aren't able to set or regulate anything in new buildings that go above and beyond that. So one of the things that is challenging, and we faced a lot of this when we were doing our climate action plan, was, I got a lot of people asking, well, can't we just make all new development in Somerville be net zero or as energy efficient as possible and use all electric systems? And the challenge there is that that really would conflict with the building code if we were to mandate certain levels of energy efficiency, or say what type of heating and cooling systems a building can use. We as through zoning and other means at the city level, we can't regulate that. So we have to get a little bit creative of how we get to that. So I think there are opportunities within zoning. So I mentioned briefly before, you can do performance-based standards through zoning. So that's one of the things that we've looked at in Somerville. And we also, we have standards for across the city in our zoning. If your building is a certain size threshold, so if you're 25,000 square feet or above, you have to meet LEED Gold. And if you're 50,000 square feet or above, you have to be LEED Platinum. So that's one way we've used zoning as a tool to help us get there. But it's not a perfect tool that kind of works all over. I think, and I think this was in the citizen petition for this district anyway, thinking about incentives as a way to kind of get some of the development that you want and using that to incentivize the sustainability features that you want to see in projects. And so that's another thing we've done in Somerville is giving away density. So, a lot of people want to be building in Somerville right now. And you can get a lot of, it's a good financial incentive to be able to build more units. So we have a residential density bonus. So if you're building the types of buildings that we want to see, so net zero ready, that you can get more units. So that makes it more attractive for developers. And so that kind of gets at the question that was asked before is what is incentivizing or what's the reason for that some developers are choosing to build net zero ready buildings. And, I think for a lot of developers, there's that interest of wanting to be a leader on this, but there might be other reasons as well. Can you create financial incentives, for example? So I think I'll leave it there because I think I'll let the others speak, but that's some of the challenges that we've faced in Somerville and some of the things that we've done to get around them.
Craig, if you'd like to go next.
Sure. And I'll start. I always like to start with opportunities because that's the positive way to look at things. I think, and my perspective comes from, working at basically the owner, so we own and operate our facilities, but being in Massachusetts, the state Mass has some great incentive programs for renewable energies. So, I said we own and operate our solar arrays. We've got some of the arrays are in SREC 1, some of the arrays are in SREC 2, some of the arrays are in the new SMART program. So those are ways that the state will incentivize folks to build solar power on their sites. The state also has a lot of good incentives right now or opportunities for battery storage to help with peak reduction. So just some good things going on in Mass right now. The technology. So if I look at our oldest solar arrays is almost 10 years old and our newest is 2 years old. The panels that we put on 10 years ago are almost, or the new panels are almost twice as efficient as the old panels. So for the same square footage of solar panel size, you can generate far more energy. So technology continues to get better and better and better. And with that, you can generate more power in a smaller space, or you can generate the same amount of power for a less money. I think that also, with the REC and VER market, so RECs, renewable energy credits, and VERs, verified emissions reductions, those are ways that you can offset your carbon emissions. So as an owner, we try to minimize our carbon emissions. We try to minimize our waste. That's always the first thing you do, because if you don't use it, you don't waste it. But we're always going to need to use electricity because we have big campuses and data centers and computers. So with that energy that we buy, if we want to buy it, we can offset those emissions by buying RECs or buying VERs. Healthy markets, a lot of stuff out there. It is a little bit of the Wild West right now. So I would caution anyone getting into it, but lots of opportunities. And at least, what I see is it's generally accepted as the right thing to do. For the most part, people think that being efficient and minimizing waste and trying to manage or eliminate or offset your carbon emissions. It's just the right thing to do. It's good. So I think those are the opportunities. Some of the challenges, and I tried to think about this in the context of, your district, transit and commuting. I don't think that you guys have public transit right there. And I know, when you go and calculate the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions from this district, your scope 3 emissions, I bet a significant part of them would be from commuting. So that's going to be a challenge that you have. Geography, it's a fairly tight, it's New England, and it's urban New England. So we've built up, it's been built for a long time. There's not a lot of spare land. So, that limits what you can do, especially when you think about, if you look where the biggest, most successful renewable energy projects are, they're out, large solar farms in the desert or large. We don't really have those opportunities here, especially in Eastern Mass. Time is always a constraint. So someone coming in to do a project there, this is all well and good, but they're gonna probably want some certainty, and they're probably gonna want to understand, okay, and I enter the permitting process on day one, when do I get out? Because time equals money and tenants and surety. From a renewable standpoint, so as I mentioned, we own and operate all our own renewable systems, but with the type of development I think you guys envisioned, where you have many smaller buildings instead of a large campus, it's probably not feasible for individual buildings to build and own their own arrays. So you may need to look at some type of ownership model where maybe you lease the top deck of a garage, or you do things like that as the district, and then ask tenants or developers to participate. I think one of the other challenges that some of the folks may face is actually calculating your greenhouse gas emissions. It sounds easy, but the devil's in the details. And I know for us, we have someone that's their job, and it's taken quite a bit of time to really get your arms around EUI, PUE for our data centers, and all our total GHG emissions. Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, I'll go with just talking about opportunities too. I like focusing on the opportunities like Craig. And I'll say that we at Boston Properties University, we had this speaker named Andrew McAfee from MIT, and he wrote this book, More from Less. And he points to 4 reasons to be optimistic. And the first is tech progress. And we see an awful lot of tech progress on renewables, on the R3 or triple pane glazing that we saw earlier, looking at advanced mechanical systems, building management systems, controls, thermal envelope technologies to end thermal bridging and make the envelope much tighter. So there's a lot of tech progress, and that's reason to be optimistic. The second is responsive government. And I think we have very responsive government in Lexington, which is indicative of this meeting, certainly in Somerville, Cambridge, where we do a lot of development, and the city of Boston are good examples as well, where net zero and carbon performance regulations are coming at us quickly. The third piece is public awareness, and public awareness has never been greater. You see this with Lexington's energy inventory from November. The amount of information that the public has on energy and emissions and the sources and how to mitigate emissions and climate change is just at an all-time high. You see a lot of attention. I try not to spend too much time on Twitter. If that's any indicator of public awareness, it's through the roof. And the Green New Deal and the support that's gotten is, I think, a great indicator of public awareness on climate and the need to act. And then the last one's capitalism. And I'll say that this year, unlike any other, our investors are sending more signals to Boston Properties that they want us to be a sustainable developer. So corporate social responsibility, which was once window dressing and a pretty sustainability report, is now something that investors are looking at as material information. BlackRock, Larry Fink, in his letter from January, said they're going to place sustainability at the center of all their investments. That's a fundamental reshaping of finance, I believe, focusing on sustainability and climate risk, integration of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures into public filings is something the SEC is expected to move on very soon. So for those 4 reasons, tech progress, capitalism, public awareness, and responsive government, there's an awful lot of reason to be optimistic, and there's a lot of opportunity. I'll say the challenges, and I'll look at challenges through the context of a project we completed in Boston, 888 Boylston Street, Boston's most sustainable office building. The challenge from the beginning is disrupting the status quo. You know, when people have been doing something a certain way and they've been successful, they don't want to do new things. People do not want to work in systems they cannot and do not understand. We've known that from brokerage for a long time, not to pick on brokers, but they don't want to discuss requirements or commitments that they don't understand how to execute, or what the cost model is, or how, you know, what it is. So learning and understanding new things often involves taking risks. And so at 88 Boylston Street, we did our first active chilled beam system. We had Sherman Fairchild as an example. We had AstraZeneca. We had a handful of other office buildings in Europe that we could look at. And it took a lot of time to get comfortable with a mechanical system that was going to operate for 30, 40, 50 years. These are long-term investments. People don't want to take risks when they're making long-term investments. That's been a huge success. And now our standard is chilled beams. We've done 3 office buildings now that are active chilled beams with dedicated outside air systems and heat recovery. The other piece is renewables. So we did solar on the roof. We've done 10 solar projects now of 8 megawatts across our portfolio. On the roof of this particular project, 888 Boylston Street, I should mention, it's 425,000 feet, 17 stories, 14 office, 3 retail. It's at the entrance to the Prudential Center on Boylston Street. We did 120 kW of solar on the roof, and that's worked beautifully, but we also did wind turbines, and they were an epic failure. They blew up the first nor'easter we had, and we had to decommission the system. That was a risk that didn't work out. So you can't be afraid to make mistakes. I think Elon Musk says, if we aren't failing, we aren't innovating. That's not an attitude that most developers have, but it is an attitude that I think is required to do new things, finding the short cliffs, taking some risks, and learning from those risks, and sharing out the successes. The other challenge has been interconnection of larger scale renewables. The utilities aren't very cooperative there. They'll slow it down, they'll pump brakes, they'll make it very hard to connect anything greater than 500 kW. We've had trouble permitting storage in not only in Boston, but also New York. In Waltham, we had some trouble with storage. So we've had a lot of trouble getting storage done. We did get storage, 3.7 megawatts of storage done in Santa Monica, but there you had great alignment of stakeholders. You had a utility that needed it to prevent rolling brownouts. You had a strong SGIP incentive that made it very financially attractive. And you had a local permitting authority that pushed it through, and a fire department that knew what it was because they had seen it quite a few places and had standards. So that's a challenge of doing new things within jurisdictions where you have all these other stakeholders that work for the municipality that need to be comfortable with technology like storage that may have perceived risks. And then the last one, I think, and this has been hard for the industry, is to quantify the value of developing sustainable product if it's more expensive to build. And I can say with full confidence that we have greater stakeholder cohesion on this issue now than we ever had. We have tenants that want to be in sustainable buildings, that have their own sustainable programs and strategies and initiatives, and their real estate decisions are one of the largest decisions they make from an environmental impact. So they want to be in sustainable buildings, and their demands and requirements are increasing. Like I mentioned, we have investors that care an awful lot. We have cities that have disclosure ordinances, and I was happy to hear earlier, I think from Stella, that a building energy use disclosure ordinance may be coming. We do that everywhere. It's been very useful for me as a sustainability program lead to have all that data from our properties. So there's great cohesion there among stakeholders that I think is going to help us overcome some of these challenges of value creation and how we communicate value creation, whether it's providing the incentives to demonstrate that value is being created, or having customers on the other end and investors that want to see these projects succeed and buy in. So that's an overview for me. 88 Boylston Street is the most sustainable office building in Boston. I will defend that. We have a site EUI of 39. So pretty respectable, right? Payette? Liz?
That sounds good. Yeah.
Respectable,
Could I-
39?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I just make one comment on what Ben said? And, he brought up the issue of cost. And I just wanted to point out those two projects that I presented were both DCAM projects. And so there wasn't really an option of going spending a lot of money over budget. We had to figure out ways to do that were cost effective. And we did a lot of shifting of costs. So spending more money on the enclosure, spending less on the mechanical systems. And that all had to be defended from a life cycle cost perspective as well. So I think, but also to Ben's point about sort of ingrained patterns of behavior, you really have to have a team that is like, we are going to do this and we're going to figure out how to do it in a cost-effective way. And then you can do it. But it's hard to achieve.
Yeah, it starts with the vision, right? And it started with our executive in Boston, Brian Koop, who said, this is going to be Boston's most sustainable office building, with the entire team there. The MEP, the architect, the contractor, everyone was there, bought in early. And there was a lot of that trade-off, understanding where you could VE and still get the sustainability goals for the project met. For the record, ground source heat pumps was one of those VE items. It was such a tight site and such a small amount of area where you could excavate and drill wells. It just didn't make sense. So we have a very small boiler that burns very few gas kBTUs, but is there to provide the small amount of heat that building demands.
So Ben, just to echo on your comments on interconnection and Eversource. So it's funny, we find that they're a great partner from an incentive standpoint. We work with them a lot and they help us with projects and help fund it. On the interconnect side, we've got over 1 megawatt of generation and it becomes a challenge. And I don't think my experience is not because they want it to be a challenge necessarily, but there are so many different things going on within the utility and so many, this is new to them and utilities don't like new. So I guess to all of you folks, making connections early with Eversource or with your utility provider and making sure that they're aware of what you want to do in this district and getting them to buy in, I think will be really helpful.
And if anybody's from Eversource listening, I'd say, yes, they don't want to make it hard, but they also haven't made it easy like they have with the new construction program and the efficiency incentives in our existing buildings. And I agree that they're phenomenal in those areas, not so much on DG.
Thank you. And thanks all of you for your response to that first question. It's really great to hear a robust discussion, and I love the back and forth. Just to everyone in the chat, I want you to know that we see your questions, and once we finish with the panel discussion, we'll hope to address some of those that you have directed for the panelists themselves and for staff. Being mindful of time, because we still want to ensure that we can have a further conversation with the attendees. My last sort of compiled question for the panelists is, some of this you've touched on a bit, so feel free to answer the question as you see relevant, but what is the direction of the industry when it comes to greener design and development with commercial properties, and specifically in regards to lab space, because that is the target development for this area? And then what's your perspective on what opportunities we have within Lexington for the Hartwell Innovation Park? And I'm going to ask if Hannah goes last on this one, because I'd be curious what her sort of more policy government perspective is after we hear from the developer and engineer side of things. So whichever one of you wants to jump in first, go ahead.
Okay, I feel like I've talked a lot recently. Liz,
Okay, I can go first.
Liz, you go first.
No problem. So I have to say, in terms of where I see the industry going, Payette works primarily on institutional labs. So a lot of our clients are universities and colleges and things like that. So it's maybe a little bit different. And so Ben might have a little bit of a different response to this being more on the commercial side. But I have to say, I'm kind of surprised if I think back to like where we were 5 or 10 years ago, what a quick shift we're seeing toward the focus on going all electric when you can. Obviously, there's still some of those challenges that I mentioned earlier. But I think, a few years ago, we thought like, oh, well, natural gas is going to be this transition fuel from oil and coal. And I feel like we kind of quickly realized like, oh no, we kind of have to just skip right over the natural gas thing and go right to the electric solutions as much as possible, and just really starting to push in that direction. On a lot of our institutional clients, and as well as on the healthcare side, they often have campus systems where they've got like a central plant that's producing either steam or hot water and chilled water. So we're not always trying to solve those issues at the building level. And I just wanted to mention some of them are already starting to go towards biomass or biofuels to address the carbon issue of using fossil fuels for heating, or at least planning for it in the future. So that's some of what we're seeing going on. And then to your last question, could I share the last 4 slides? So one of the kind of or emerging focuses within the world of sustainable design is thinking about embodied carbon. So I'm sure you guys are all, well aware of the emissions associated with building energy use. But there's actually a lot of emissions associated with extracting raw materials, creating building products, installing them and making them into buildings. And if you think about a building's 60-year lifetime, and you think about all the emissions that accumulate over time, you have, a little bump in the beginning that is the embodied carbon when you build a building. And then every year you get a little bit more from the building operations, such that over the 60-year lifetime, maybe 3/4 of the emissions is associated with operations and about 1/4 with building. Yeah, can you go to the next one? Thank you. Okay, go one more. Oh, okay, so this gives you an idea of global emissions. You've got maybe 1/4 from building operations, and you can see 32% from industry and 11% from building materials and construction. And about half of those two together is just associated from concrete, steel, and aluminum production. Okay, go to the next slide. So this is what I was talking about, looking at a whole building lifetime over 60 years. You get about 3/4 from operational emissions and about 1/4 embodied emissions. But the IPCC has told us that the next 10 years is really critical for addressing climate change. So what happens when we zoom into that first 10 years on this little chart? Go to the next slide. Well, when you zoom in really close to the 10-year window, so thinking about what happens between a building that's starting construction today and 2030, the relationship is flipped. And so there's a much larger portion that is related to embodied energy. And I say this because I think in Hartwell, there's an opportunity. Sounds like there's a lot of existing buildings there. And a lot of the embodied carbon comes from structures, foundations, and enclosure. So if there are buildings there, there's an opportunity to redevelop them and kind of retain that embodied carbon that's already been emitted into the atmosphere, rather than tearing it down, throwing it away, and building a new building. But there's also a bunch of strategies that you can implement in terms of doing new construction to reduce embodied carbon in concrete, for example. So that's one thing that I see as an opportunity going forward.
So I agree with that completely. We have a science-based target. So we submitted our greenhouse gas emissions inventory and all of our targets for scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 3 is the embodied energy Liz was talking about. So we've set a embodied energy reduction target aligned with the climate science. It's aligned with the Paris Agreement that the rate necessary to reduce emissions from the built environment to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And through that process, I learned a lot about embodied energy and emissions. And there are some opportunities. Absolutely, repurposing, redevelopment is the best approach. The second approach, I think, is carbon sequestration in concrete materials and better mix designs. So specifying lower carbon concrete that uses less Portland cement, which is where most of the emissions come from. There are glass additives that can reduce the amount of Portland cement. There's also a company we're talking about now called Carbon Cure that actually stores carbon, waste carbon from industrial processes in their concrete. It's still manufactured by the same plants. They just have a sort of, they interface with the manufacturing process to add the sequestered carbon. The second, I think, huge opportunity is evolving how we approach timber frame, large scale construction in this country. And I still think we have a ways to go, but there are definitely some promising time advantages to timber frame. I don't think they're over all the fireproofing and fire code requirements and some of the structural issues that may reduce column spans and the size, the height of timber frame. But I think that is absolutely something that is going to evolve, and you're going to see more timber in commercial construction as a result of this focus on scope 3. The future, I think, is net zero, and the real question is, how do you achieve net zero construction with some of the issues that were raised earlier at the Cape Cod School, where you have this really high energy intensity that if you meet with electrical systems, you're adding significantly to your peak load. And so you're upsizing your switchgear and your costs. So I think one of the opportunities here is to make electrification priority, right? And make sure that developers are looking at it and making the case for electrifying or not electrifying, if there is a good case to be made for not electrifying. The simple economics of it, with gas being 1/3 the cost of electricity, with the switchgear and service capacities required to electrify, limitations of the grid, and it's going to require partnership with customers, with developers, and also with utilities if we're going to go to an all-electric system, especially considering the compounded effects of electrifying real estate while also adding electric vehicle charging to the same grid infrastructure. I read a report the other day that over the last 100 years, we've built a grid system that we will need to double over the next 10 years to electrify and decommission fossil fuels. So the scale of the improvements, the grid modernization, and the upsizing of electrical supply and capacity should not be lost on anybody pushing for electrification of thermal systems and the addition of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So, and that was a report from Enviro, not from not from somebody arguing against it. Someone that wants to see it get done. The magnitude of the investment we need to make in distribution, generation, and storage infrastructure is probably going to be, if I was a millennial or if I was what are they, the Gen Zs right now, that's where I'd be focused, because there's going to be a lot of work to be done in improving our grid and the generation.
Great. I'll jump in. I know time's tight, so I'll keep it quick. I think we've said a lot of this, but from a direction, people have generally accepted that this is the right thing to do, and for the most part, people, owners, developers are on the bandwagon and moving forward. As I mentioned before, the rec and VER market is there, and there are opportunities there to offset your emissions. So I think that's helpful. Electrification is also, Ben, you said it a bunch of times, but that we're moving in that direction. I think some of the key opportunities, for you guys at Hartwell, if you can. As I looked at your plan, I still struggled with how would you make a whole bunch of small buildings owned potentially by different folks work on one local renewable grid. So an opportunity might be to try to figure that out ahead of time, whether it's with a PPA or whether it's some other kind of agreement with a single solar developer or something. But that's a challenge that I think the town probably needs to think hard about before you get into doing a lot of the development there, because if you let it go too long, you're going to have a bunch of different owners, and I think you might struggle with that. So I'll stop there.
Okay, I'll jump in and try to add some new perspective here. I think generally where I see things going, like everyone said before, there's a lot of interest in building net zero buildings and really pushing the envelope to make buildings as electric as possible and release as few emissions as possible. And so what I find really exciting is that we're starting to see really innovative buildings come online that demonstrate that it's possible to build net zero buildings and that they're feasible, they can be cost effective, and so that we have more examples to point to. So that to me is really exciting. I think on the city side and the municipal side, we're seeing more cities and towns in Massachusetts coming up with innovative policies. We have our zoning in Somerville. Boston is working on new zoning proposals as well. I think there's a lot of innovation in this space as well to try to figure out what works and how do we create regulations at the local level that can push for this development and require kind of meeting the standards that we need to be meeting in order to reach our emissions targets, while also working with industry to figure out what's feasible, because we still want development to happen. And there's a lot of need for that for a number of reasons, but how do we make that as sustainable as possible? For Hartwell specifically, I think thinking about performance-based standards is one opportunity. And I think another kind of frame for it is thinking about, could this be an area to demonstrate how life sciences can be sustainable and working towards that carbon neutral future? So how can we position Hartwell to kind of like lead on that front and really demonstrate regionally that these projects can be built? And then I think finally, I know this conversation was very much focused on building emissions, but thinking about zoning a little bit more holistically and the opportunities that you might have to think about emissions related to transportation or how you're managing stormwater on site, and really thinking about how development fits within the broader landscape and environment, and provides multiple services kind of across the board. So I think that's another tool that zoning actually is really good for, where it might not be the best tool to really get it mandating certain building types and things like that. It can be a really great tool for addressing some of those other sustainability principles.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks all the panelists again for entertaining my questions and offering your insights. We'll allow a few moments for attendees to continue to send in some questions, and I'll hand it over to Daphne so we can do a couple more polls before we go into our public discussion.
Before we go into that, thank you everyone for joining us. I do have so this recording will be available on our website, hiplexington.com. Liz, I do have a question. Do you mind if you had like amazing slides out there? Do you mind if we share that with the public?
Sure. I think as long as, does it get posted as like a PDF or?
PDF, yes.
PDF, yeah. I think
yeah, it's part of this docket. So yeah, I'll get back to you on that, but I'm sure there will be questions about looking at those numbers again. So I just wanted to learn that before we move on. Thank you so much.
So as Stella said, before we get into the discussion, we just wanted to ask you, this is some of what we've heard in previous forums. And we'd like you to think about the three most important features in terms of sustainability for the built environment in the Hartwell Innovation Park. So take a moment, please, and think about choosing the three most important features for the built environment, not the natural. That's a separate question. About half of you have entered your selections. And as Hannah was saying about the transportation, that's something we'll be discussing next week. So we'll have a whole session on that. So just so you know. So it looks like decreasing emissions produced by buildings is the absolute number one at 91%. And then we have maximize alternative non-car 65. And then the visible sustainability, solar and recycling. Thank you for that. And now we'd like to ask you, in terms of the natural environment, these are some of the things that you have said, those of you who have participated in prior forums, that were important to you in terms of the sustainability features in the HIP district. So please let us know what the three most important ones are to you.
Just to clarify, it's only allowing you to select one. So just click one and then submit.
Choose your most important. Sorry about that constraint. And if you'd like, you can put in the chat something else you'd like to emphasize. So it looks like preserving the mature trees is the number one. And then decreasing emissions produced by vehicles and managing stormwater. Thank you. And sorry about the constraining you to one. So thought we'd give a chance to those of you who've been patient that have had asked questions much earlier on. So one of the questions is, what can you do to encourage the use of technologies if companies are not already predisposed to using them? And before the panelists answer that, I'd just like to point out that Stella framed her presentation by saying it was hip to be sustainable. And that wasn't just a pun on words. Actually, a lot of people who want to work in life sciences are attracted to that kind of image and that kind of branding. So that's one thought. Panelists, would you like to respond to that? How can companies be encouraged, if not incentivized, to build in sustainable ways?
So I'll start by just saying that revealing the value to the end user is always important. And one area where we hadn't had much traction is on indoor air quality monitoring. We saw very limited deployment of PM 2.5 sensors, which is fine particulate, and even limited deployment of CO2 sensors. And this COVID-19 pandemic and predating the pandemic, research by Dr. Joe Allen, the Harvard School of Public Health, revealed the importance of fresh air for cognitive function and the importance of fine particulate matter management as a proxy for air quality, right? You want to make sure your air is being properly filtered. So a lot of developers that were resistant to adding indoor air quality sensoring are now rushing to add sensoring because there is a customer demand for the information, and transparency is a way of building trust with customers around indoor air quality. So connecting the dots between the value proposition and the customer demand, I think is very important. And so that's certainly one area. I can think of probably a couple more as well, but that one resonates with me because that's what I'm working on at the moment. I do think that sustainability, like, you have to know how to sell it. And a lot of people don't know how to communicate the sustainable attributes of their own buildings. And then you have customers that are really sophisticated, like Salesforce, which we built Salesforce Tower in San Francisco, tallest tower in San Francisco, that has a black water treatment system. So they can drink the toilet water essentially if they want to. They're not drinking it. I don't want to spread that rumor. They're reusing the treated toilet water from the building in their flush fixtures and irrigation, which is pretty minimal, and cooling tower makeup. So there you have a customer that is extolling the virtues of that building more than we are as the owner developer, because they're excited about their black water treatment plant. So I think getting the customer excited about sustainability and so they can do some virtue signaling, they can do some leadership among their peers, and they can signal to their own supply chain. I think is increasingly what's driving us to push further and faster in a few areas, like rainwater harvesting and black water treatment.
So I'll ask a couple of other questions that of the patient folks who've been asking earlier on. And in the meantime, if you would like to be recognized to ask a question live, please raise your hand, either by using the raise your hand function at the bottom. If you cannot find it or it's not available to you, then just put your hand up next to your face and someone will find you. Promise. So another question. Does having self-sustaining low emissions buildings scale up to the district level? So we've all discussed here tonight individual buildings. Can it scale up to the district level?
I believe it may work better that way.
And actually, Craig, you pointed out about having shared solar panels or a shared grid to connect to, right, as being a more efficient.
Yes. Potentially. I think it could work better.
Okay. Anyone else want to say anything about that?
I'll just add that I think, and in Somerville, the way we think about net zero is actually not at the building scale. So individually, if we don't expect every individual building to be able to meet all of its energy needs by just generating that on site. We're also the densest city in New England, so we have a lot of space constraints, but really thinking about district scale. So, how can you, if you're building a building that's as efficient as possible, using minimizing fossil fuel usage, that makes it easier to meet all of those energy needs with renewables that are generated, from another site nearby or from the grid, right? So as our grid gets cleaner and cleaner, that brings everyone towards net zero. So that's kind of how we think about it, is that, the individual building is important, but it's all adding up to a whole that, as we make those buildings more efficient, it becomes easier at scale to meet our future demand for renewables.
So there were some very specific questions with regard to the technologies. One was, does the heat pumps technology transfer, and this one is mostly towards Liz, from the Cape Cod example to a commercial lab? So can you do?
I mean, I think it's possible you might have a different relationship depending on how large your building is. The Cape Cod building is fairly small. It's just under 100,000 square feet. And it's on the sort of spectrum of intensity of lab buildings, it's maybe on the less intensive side. So, I mean, certainly you could use air source heat pumps to meet some of your heating and cooling load and make up the difference with a natural gas boiler. If your project is, I mean, the thing with ground source heat pumps is they're very kind of site specific. So it depends on whether or not you have the right ground conditions to be able to use a system type like that. But certainly in all of these cases, the most important thing to do first is to like drive down your loads. So take advantage of whatever kind of passive measures you can, natural daylighting and passive solar. Then you want to have a really robust envelope and then meet those kind of reduced building loads with efficient systems. And I don't have time to get into it here, but even on something that's intensive as a lab, the building envelope can really make a big difference.
So related to that is, well, actually related to the previous, is a question about, since the new zoning is allowing for a larger number of square feet, and a lot of that will be lab space, how does it compare in terms of, let's say, number of people accommodated in an office space versus lab space? And that's related to the concern for increased traffic. Is that easy enough to calculate off the top of your head, or would you need to get back to us?
It's so dependent on the space user and their program. It could go one way or another depending on what types of tenants are in a building in their program.
Okay.
Office or lab, I think you could have. Depends on the mix too. Rarely is a life sciences building pure life science. It's usually part lab, part office, and densities are variable between the two use types. Liz, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I don't think there's a hard and fast answer there.
Yeah.
So any questions from the audience? Any hands raised? Does anyone see any hand raised? So.
I have a question.
Oh, Mr. Son.
Yeah, I put some of it in the comments on the chat, but this seems to be a large-scale project, and right now on the briefing we heard that the square footage footprint of the building square footage is about 90 acres out of 150 acres, and they are allowed to be 6 stories high. So we're going to have up to 540 acres of office or lab space. And what's currently there is 150 acres with a building square footage ratio of 0.35, which is about 17.5 acres. So we are actually going to build up to 30 times what is already there in terms of lab / building space. And what concerns me is that that's going to have tremendous effect on traffic, and it's going to sit on the Hartwell Avenue longer. It's going to have a lot more emissions, and that's going to also generate pollutions as well as transforming the residential neighborhood nearby to a industrial neighborhood. But another concern is that much square footage, no matter how you cover it with solar panels, and it's not going to be self-sustaining zero-emission buildings. Just the scale of the project is not consistent with low-emission green self-sustaining idea. I think to achieve that, we have to scale down the project by quite a bit. I mean, we can double or even triple the square footage of what they have. Maybe you have a chance, but at up to 30 times, I don't think there's any chance.
Before Liz, she looks eager to respond. I just wanted to point out that this is not a project. It is just a plan that if particular property owners would like to redevelop over an extended period of time, they would do so one by one. Some may not choose to.
But then we have to have a better plan so that when it's fully developed, we have some chance have these buildings be zero emission, self-sustaining, or be close to it. And right now, what's allowed in the zoning is not consistent with that. I think we have to change the zoning so they'll be more consistent, that when the economy changes, when the building space is more scarce, developers want to make more money, and we have to have some assurance that this will be self-sustaining, or at least uh, 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 you know, fairly green, I guess.
So I think Liz wanted to say something.
Yes, I'm so glad that you brought up this point about kind of the relationship of kind of roof area and places that you can put PV to like the overall building energy use, because this is something that we've kind of been throwing around these terms about net zero and carbon neutral, and we haven't really defined that a bit. So the National Renewable Energy Lab has a really nice document that defines net zero energy buildings. And so there's different types. They have 4 classifications. So class A is where your rooftop can provide enough PV to offset all the building energy use. Class B is where you need to use maybe the rooftop and some of your site area to provide enough PV to power your building. Class C, you start to get into, maybe you need it to bring in some biofuels from offsite. So you're importing some energy resources into your site in combination with PV. And then the last one is Class D. And those 2 projects that I shared with you earlier are actually designed to be Class D net zero energy buildings, which means the rooftop is covered with PV, but because, as I mentioned, lab and healthcare buildings are so intensive, and as you acknowledge also, you just can't possibly provide enough PV on one building of that type, especially when you're getting into those taller building heights. And so it relies on purchasing renewable energy from the grid that's produced elsewhere. So yeah, that's definitely, it's definitely going to be hard to make a net zero, campus where all the buildings, are energy right on that site. But you certainly could do it by purchasing renewable power from other places.
I do have problem with purchasing, because that's really, you're not building anything green. You're really using, fuel. If we purchase that, somebody is going to purchase, fossil fuel somewhere else to make up for it. That doesn't sound very green to me. I think it'd be better if we zoned in a way that if developer follows, there's some chance that these will be zero emission, self-sustaining. I mean, there are other technologies. You can put solar panels somewhere else. People talk about putting on the pavement, but even if you do that, I think zoning has to be changed, or at least require that these buildings be zero emission, or is something close to. But purchasing is just, you purchase a biofuel, somebody needs to buy fossil fuel.
Just one thing to add to that quickly. I would say that when you build your zoning out and you put these, whether they're requirements or suggestions in there, I would just be careful to make sure that whatever you put in the zoning, one, isn't too keyed in on what technology is hot today, because the technology is going to change quickly. And also make sure that, or I would recommend that you make sure that whatever you're asking folks to do is actually feasible. So the idea of the class A through D net zero buildings, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly that most of the buildings you're probably looking at in this district can't produce enough solar with their rooftop arrays to cover all the energy use, but they could easily purchase renewable energy credits or renewable energy from the grid to supplement what they make on site. Allowing for that type of flexibility, I think, will maybe put your district in a better position for success.
But again, if you purchase,
I think we also have a question from Cindy, who's been waiting patiently for her question. So
And everyone needs a turn. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists and to Lexington's staff for putting this on. I wanted to thank Ben for bringing up indoor air quality. I think that's a really important thing that we need to be talking about as well. And we need to learn more My question was, I had actually put it in the chat, but for Liz or Ben or any other panelists, actually, it sounds like the technology for all electric life science laboratory buildings is within reach. I know that we're really getting close. How far off do you think we are? I mean, Craig was mentioning earlier about how quickly, technology is changing. How far off do you think we are? And a second quick question. Ben, you mentioned, the one of the challenges is that there are other developers that that change is hard. Doing something different is hard, even if it, saves you some money or, with the life cycle costs or something. So are there sort of things happening in the development and real estate community that are sort of, outreaching? Like what sort of organizations are sort of doing that in the development and real estate community? So 2 questions. Thank you.
All right, so let's start with the second question because I think it's the easier one. I think the Urban Land Institute is doing important work. I think that the International Living Future Institute is doing really important work on living buildings, and Sean Hesse over there would be a great person to talk with about the living building standard and how that's been evolving. Urban Land Institute is where a lot of the development community gathers, and the attention on sustainability is at an all-time high. I'm on the Sustainability Product Council, and we have more people wanting to guest at our meetings and figure out what we're talking about than the urban development councils and all the conventional sort of future retail councils. So sustainability is definitely the hot topic at the moment there. So ULI as the developer focus group and the International Living Future group institute as I'd say the leader on the built environment. However, the typologies they deal with are very different from 100,000 plus square foot life science buildings, where I think coming back to the comments Liz made on the different classifications of net zero, there's absolutely, a footprint beyond the building itself includes renewables offsite. And that's just going to be a fact, I think, going forward with this type of real estate, unless you have a huge site and land area that supports megawatt scale solar development, which is extremely rare in areas where the land values are so high, developable land values. So I think that your first question is complicated by it depends on what the land use constraints are, and it depends on what you can do. So if you have a fairly accessible heat sink, and you can do ground source heat wells, and you can do air source heat pumps, and you can develop renewables on site and procure renewables off site, I think you could do net zero now with life sciences, but it's going to be, I think, a heavy lift to get all those components together for the job, particularly the ground source heat pumps. For me, that's been the largest constraint on these projects. There's huge time and cost impacts to doing ground source heat pump systems. We do have one in Weston. It's the Quarry, Boston Post Road. It's the Biogen building. And we use the Quarry water there to provide essentially free cooling and help with our heating loads year round. So we have basically a straw that goes down to the quarry 400 feet deep. And we have a coefficient of performance on our chiller plant that's 10 compared to like 6 is what we can get with the most efficient chillers. So there's absolutely efficiency benefit and also a great story using the quarry cooling at that project. I'm a fan of ground source heat pumps. I know that Boston University is doing a big life sciences building now with some laboratory program, but they still maintained a natural gas feed to the building because their engineers were concerned about the air source heat pumps, the reliability on the peak days, those peak heating days in the cold of the winter. are these air source heat pumps going to perform? So I think the easiest answer to your question is our heat pump technology continues to get better. As that technology gets better and engineers are more confident in its reliability during peak conditions, that's typically in the winter, then you're going to have more life sciences buildings cutting and removing fossil fuel infrastructure. But right now, for reliability of the system and the reliability of heating, space heating, you do see fossil fuel connections remaining. I will say we're doing a net zero development in San Francisco, and we're going 100% electric. We're doing 300 kW of solar on the roof. We're buying all of our power green off site and what we don't produce on site. And we're using a water source heat pump system that doesn't require ground source heat pumps. It's connected to the cooling towers. And because of the mild climate in the Bay Area, it's a fundamentally different problem to solve in San Francisco than it is to solve in Boston. We could never build that product in Boston without a gas service. So, or a very, very large electrical supply.
So here's a question for Hannah. Can you comment on the use of provisions like the green score in Somerville's zoning ordinance as a way to incentivize sustainable landscaping while allowing for creativity and not being too prescriptive? And is it working?
Sure, I can try to answer that, though I am not the green score expert for the city. So in our zoning, we have what is called a green score. So this is some landscaping measures, and instead of being prescriptive and saying exactly what type of landscaping you need to do, it weights different factors for the environmental benefits that those different landscaping measures provide. So, for example, you can get more points if you're preserving large trees or managing stormwater on site. Things like that will weight more heavily, and you'll be able to get more points for that through the system. So it's basically like, similar to LEED, where you can get a number of different points. It's similar to that in a way, though it's just for Somerville in our zoning, and it's a way to kind of get what we want from the landscaping while allowing for that creativity. And I would say that it is working. Though I'm not the landscape person. I'm much more on the building side of things. But I think it's been useful, and I know that other cities have similar models that they've had in their zoning that we modeled ours off of as well.
Anna, what do you get for the points? Is it a density bonus?
No, it's required. So this is, you have to meet a certain threshold, and how you get there is up to you based on the point system that has been established.
So Liz or Ben, could you please explain what a chilled beam is, what a dual wheel enthalpy system is, and why they're important for these types of designs?
Yes, this is a good question. So if you think about probably a lot of buildings, if you imagine, I have this great picture, but I don't have it with me. Imagine you have a big garbage bag, 2 big garbage bags, and you scoop them full of air and then hold them closed like balloons, okay? And then imagine you also have a little tiny cup of water, and you can transfer as much heat energy in that little tiny cup of water as you can with those 2 big bags of air. So it takes a lot of energy to blow that air around to heat the building, okay? So a lot of building systems are traditionally VAV, so they're heating up a big volume of air and blowing it into the building, or cooling it down and blowing it into the building. And then a certain percentage of the air is recirculated. So dedicated outdoor air systems, only a portion of that air is what you actually need to provide fresh air from the outside, setting aside the issues with indoor air quality that Ben brought up earlier. There's a minimum that's required, and that volume of air is much smaller than what you would need to use to heat or cool a building with air. So you're bringing in these dedicated outdoor air systems, and there's a wheel inside the air handling unit that spins sort of through the incoming airstream and the outgoing airstream. and it's going to transfer some of that energy from the outgoing air to the incoming air. So if it's in the middle of winter, you're not just exhausting all that hot air that you just heated up in your building outside. You're using it to kind of preheat the air coming in, and similarly in the summertime for cooling. And then often these types of systems are coupled with chilled beams. So instead of blowing all that hot or cold air, oh my goodness, my battery's right now, around the building, you pump water around. So it's a lot more efficient to pump water around that can carry a lot more energy. And then, so a chilled beam has these pipes of hot water or chilled water coming through them, and that little bit of ventilation air comes over it. And the shape of it sort of induces a convection current to provide more efficient heating or cooling in your space. I'm gonna go grab my power cord.
I'll just comment quickly. So MathWorks, we've adopted chilled beams. Our newest campus, we have almost 2,000 individual offices with all chilled beam. And it gives, the benefit is, so each office has its own thermostat. So each office, each person in an office can adjust their temperature. The downside, and the thing that you guys may need to deal with, is the upfront construction cost is higher, and it's far more complex to operate. So the other side of my world is, if you have 4,000 people in your building and they're not happy because they're either too hot or too cold, that's problematic. So it's a great technology. It works well. It's, like I said, more expensive and more difficult to operate. So you need to factor that in, and that may scare away maybe smaller developers or smaller buildings.
You guys are very generous with your zones there. One per office. That is it's not a developer building. We would probably do, one per 3, 4.
So Tina McBride has her hand up. Can someone please invite her to speak?
You should be able to unmute yourself, Tina.
Which it is about we found a $6 to $8 per square foot premium to build chilled beam when we built it. So there is absolutely a premium.
Tina?
Yes, hi, thanks. I appreciate the statements, particularly those by Liz and Ben, saying that energy requirements would be higher than just rooftop solar could provide. The quarry water energy harvesting is a very good story, Ben. You're right. It's very, very cool. But I wonder, has Boston Properties looked at like wall-mounted solar options on any of the buildings?
We have looked at building integrated photovoltaics, and the yield for the cost just has never made sense. We did see a big proposal for the GE building, the Solar Vale. Everyone was very excited that was going to be right on the Fort Point channel. That was never succeeded. I think a lot of these concepts, like the Solaire in New York City, are boutique buildings, and it's never really scaled. That's not to say that it won't, but it just hasn't been economical. So when you look at how do you generate renewable energy, it's more cost effective to seek additionality offsite than to try to do an integrated photovoltaic system vertically. Not to mention shading issues, which are can be problems in dense urban environments with vertical solar facades.
So a follow up on that then is the suggestion was made that solar panels now are even more efficient than say 10 years ago. So I mean, is that something that potentially in the next 10 years would be viable?
It could be. I think what continues to keep the cost up, even if you get a bit more energy per square foot solar, it's all of the electrical distribution wiring that's required to run through the entire building facade to return that direct current power to inverters and then redistribute back into the building. So it's a lot of infrastructure to capture a relatively small amount of energy. And I would bet if you looked at the embodied energy calculations for some of those projects, like it may not even pencil, or it may pencil, but it's going to take a while for the carbon return to be there on those types of energy systems because the yield is so low and the amount of infrastructure required to capture that power is so high, which is why it's not cost effective. So it's almost like the economics prove the environmental case there in many ways.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
So related to that is a question regarding the parking lot solar canopy. So can parking lot solar canopies significantly help on net zero? And
Yes.
is it counted as part of the building?
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent for solar canopies. We just built 5.2 megawatts at Carnegie Center in Princeton, New Jersey. And those systems provide over 75% of the total energy needs for 500,000 square feet of our commercial office buildings. That's 4 buildings, 4 arrays, and over 75% of total energy. But you need a large surface lot. You need a utility that's willing to interconnect, again, megawatt scale solar. And these projects are behind the meter. So there's 2 types of connections. There's behind the meter and net metered. And behind the meter means that the output from the inverter ties directly into our building switchgear, and the power is consumed in the building. And what we don't need to consume is exported as net excess generation back to PSE&G, the utility. The other form is net metered, and in that case, the power flows directly to the utility, and the account owner typically gets a credit for a value per kilowatt hour, and that can be assigned typically to any building in the load zone. So it's not necessarily consumed in the building itself. For a variety of reasons, usually either economic or grid constraints, that a project may choose to go one direction or the other, net metered or behind the meter.
So this question is probably for staff. There will be a large demand for water and there will be waste generated that needs to be disposed of. Are there any plans to deal with this? Amanda or Sandia?
I do want to recognize that Karen Mullins, who is our conservation director, is on the call as well. Amanda, do you want to start? And then probably Karen or Carol might have something to add.
This is Amanda. So basically we need to do of what can be built and what can't be built to determine how much additional infrastructure capacity needs to take place. So that is something that we are reviewing and investigating right now. But as part of the zoning, it would be required that developers or developments mitigate their impacts to the system to help offset those costs that they would be contributing for the increased demand.
So it's someone is noting that it seems that everyone agrees that there's a growing market for sustainable building projects. If this is the case, is there an argument for putting in even more stringent sustainable incentives requiring buildings over 2 stories instead of 5 to be made sustainable? I assume, Mr. Mike Beverly, that this is a question with regard to town-wide, or did you mean it only with regard to Hartwell? Only Hartwell. So who would like to respond to that? Should it be that these requirements kick in at 2 stories and above, or keep it at the 5 stories?
So that is why we were looking, this is Amanda again, that's why we were looking to have these discussions to get more impact from, one, the developers and also the community to see what the appetite would be for increased development, because looking at only the LEED side of it, there's a lot more sustainability options that can be incorporated. However, when we're writing the zoning, we need it to be flexible enough because, as previously mentioned, just because it's solar, not all projects can put solar on their roofs or on their site to offset their costs. So we need to be able to be flexible. If a project can't do one thing, but then they can offer something else that's equally sustainable, we need to be able to allow them to do that.
Sort of like Hannah's description of the green score.
Correct, yes.
So meet a certain threshold, but you figure out how you can do it given your palette.
Exactly, yep.
So it is 9 o'clock. Anybody else have a burning question? Raise your hand, put it in the chat. And if you don't have one now, but one occurs to you 5 minutes after we get off the call, remember that on Thursday, December 17th, at 8 a.m., there'll be a whole hour devoted to discussing anything you'd like to discuss, as long as it's about HIP and as long as you're HIP. So I'm going to hand it back to Sandhya.
I do want to thank you so much, Daphne. Thank you, everyone, all the panelists, and it was a great session. I think one of the most robust sessions that we've had so far. Great questions from the audience as well. I do want to recognize that we do have the HIP draft zoning bylaw on our website, on the town's website, as well as on hiplexington.com. If you would want to refer to it and have more questions, direct it towards us, and we'll be happy to answer those. Some of the materials are available on our website as of now. December 14th, we'll be back with a session regarding transportation. I know there's a lot of questions regarding transportation mitigation on Hartwell, and we'll be more than happy to answer those on the 14th. And if you have any more questions, please direct it to us. We did have a lot of comments last time about having a session which is open for everyone without any topics associated with it, and have an open discussion about Hartwell rezoning initiative. And that's why we have this coffee hour that we started with earlier in October. So we are again coming up with a coffee hour on the 17th, when you can come up with any questions regarding Hartwell rezoning initiative, and we'll be more than happy to answer those. I want to introduce the team again: Carol Kowalski, who's the Assistant Town Manager for Development, Amanda Loomis, Planning Director, and myself, I'm the Economic Development Director, Sheila Page, Assistant Planning Director, Casey Haggerty, Economic Development Coordinator, and Stella Carr, Sustainability Director. And I really want to thank Daphne Politis, who is our moderator, a gracious host for us. She's been fantastic. So with this, I think I'm going to reintroduce Bob Creech with us.
Yes, thank you,
One
Sandhya.
thing, I'm sorry, Bob, I did this to you last time too, but there is one more thing to announce, that the table of uses is going to be released next week. So just so everyone knows and you could get a chance to look at it. Bob, please take it away.
Oh, thank you, Daphne. This is Bob Creech, Chair of the Lexington Planning Board, and I adjourn this meeting of the Lexington Planning Board. Thank you.